All right. So today we are going to talk about the chain of solutions, and we're going to talk about developing and prioritizing a series of improvements to maximize the impact with the minimal investment. So we're going to identify where to focus, show how to drill in and find the opportunities for improvement with the subject matter experts, and show how to reduce the stress and anxiety at the same time we're increasing the profit for the organization. And what's the right sequence um, to make those improvements in order to have the most impact and increase the flow. So the reason that I built upon the body of knowledge within TLS is because I was responsible for 24 facilities around the country, and I had a small team of about 3 people, including interns, in order to manage improvements across those 24 facilities around the country. So we had to figure out what should we be focusing on to have the most impact. Okay, so this is the third webinar in a series of 4. Tomorrow will be the fourth one. And the first one was about making a strong comeback as the economy comes back from the pandemic, from the COVID-19 virus. Then we went into the basics of TLS, which is the combination of theory of constraints and Lean Six Sigma. And what we're trying to do here is go from managing everybody in the organization, focusing on a wide variety of problems and not necessarily a coherent direction, to very focused and aligned organization that is knocking out the most critical obstacles in a very strategic sequence. So what we're talking about here is when revitalizing the flow from the situation that we're in now by applying TLS to stabilize, enhance, and increase the flow through our organizations. In order to do that, we need to assess where we're at, plan what we need to do, and then execute it. So we need to know some information about the demand, what's driving it, what's inhibiting it, as well as the supply and our capacity. So when the pandemic hit, we might have had a backlog, but it quickly reduced for many companies. At the same time, we weren't able to respond and reduce costs as fast as the demand decreased. So when these two lines crossed, we actually became unprofitable in many organizations. So you can see that although efforts have been taken to reduce expenses, you cannot completely eliminate all the overhead, right? So we went from this much profit to some amount of loss for most organizations. Now, there are some organizations where the sales have actually spiked, but we're focusing on the ones right now that need to recover. So what we want to do is focus our improvement efforts in a way that we can reduce a lot of the disruptions and distractions and delays and downtime and defects, so that with the resources we still have in place, we can get some more volume through. And that may mean that we have to do a little bit of searching to get that demand, right? As well as getting our profit back to the level that it was before this all happened. Okay, even if we are at a lower rate, if we can reduce some of those expenses that are unnecessary that we've been carrying in the form of overtime, rework, scrap, and other wastes, then we can get back to being profitable even if we are at a lower volume. So from there, as we start to ramp up and drive our demand higher, we want to continue to do so as the economy recovers. And while we're doing that, we need to manage the expenses. So we don't want to ramp up our expenses faster than we're ramping up our sales, right? So we got to keep that coordinated to keep the blue line above 0. Okay. So once we have scaled back up to handle our increase in sales volume, we want to continue what we've learned back in this phase on how to continue to drive improvements that allow us to get more done with the existing resources. So we're increasing our sales here while we're not increasing our expenses at the same rate. And that allows us to get to a point where we can actually become more profitable than we were before this all began. So um, TLS is the theory of constraints plus Lean Six Sigma, which gives you a way to rapidly improve with the scientific and intuitive sequencing for your improvements. So with the theory of constraints, we have identifying and defining our goals, focusing on the constraints, using buffer management, using strategic planning, and it's very throughput driven. With Lean, it's customer value focused. We have waste identification and reduction tools. We have a high level of employee engagement, and it's pull driven to produce to what the customers are actually demanding. With Six Sigma, we have a team oriented structured problem solving approach that's data driven, focused on improving the effectiveness and efficiency. And there are a lot of variation identification and reduction tools in that. So we've got goal driven, focused, collaborative, data driven, obstacle removing, and value increasing methodology here. So we've combined those to have a synergistic approach that takes all of the strengths and complements the weaknesses of each of those. Okay. So with those, we have the Lean tools, we've got the theory of constraints tools and methods, and we have the Six Sigma tools and methods. So now what we're going to talk about is how do we put that together in a sequence that makes the most sense to get the most impact. So there is a body of knowledge about that we're building upon here, and Bob Sproul has done a ton of work to help with this. So he has 6 really good books that to help bring people up to speed, and there are a few other ones out there like Velocity by D. Jacobs and Jeff Cox. And so we start here. We get with the ultimate improvement cycle, that which is what UIC stands for. At the core, you've got the theory of constraints and the 5 focusing steps. With Lean, you've got the green here, and then with Six Sigma, you've got the blue. So they all work together synergistically. So we complete the picture of the system in terms of the flow, what the predicted people behaviors are, and we're only tracking efficiency at the constraint with this, so that we're not overproducing and creating additional WIP at other non-constraints. Okay, then we have our knowledge of the knowledge of the location and types of waste and some of the potential core system problems. Then we know the location and the type of the variation and defects in our system. Then we come up with a coherent action plan on how to improve our system capacity. Then we get our constraint very organized and minimize the waste there. Then we get our constraint under control. Then we come up with a coherent plan on how to synchronize the rest of the organization based on the flow that we can get through the constraint. And this gets us to the point where we have a well-functioning process with synchronized flow throughout the system. At this point, we can optimize our safety buffers as we continue to reduce variation so that we carry less and less WIP and other types of inventory. And then we develop a coherent sustainment plan and optimize the process capabilities and controls. So at this point, we can have a complete understanding of the new capacities of the system, and we have a financial understanding about where we're at versus where we were with throughput accounting. And the next phase is we implement our sustainment actions to keep things from going backwards, and we're using throughput accounting to make sound financial decisions on what additional improvements can take us to the next level. Okay, so this is where we're going to start to introduce the chain of solutions. Some of you've gotten a preview from the last 2 webinars, and what we're going to do here is show how the chain of solutions can help us drive profitability while we're reducing stress with a series of improvements. So the chain of solutions is a cross between um, high-level process map, an affinity diagram, SIPOC map, an FMEA, interference diagram, um, multi-voting, a prioritization matrix, and a simplified QFD. I know that's a lot, but once you see it, you'll see that it's not that complicated. And this is used to basically drive a project portfolio that's highly sequenced for the most impact. Okay. So the phases are discover, survey, explore, plant, harvest, and expand, and then repeat. Okay. So during the discover phase, we're assessing the demand, defining the value and the goals, and identifying where we're going to focus for our target. During survey, I refer to that as mapping it. We measure, analyze, and prioritize. Then during explore, we identify and select potential solutions and go from ideas to concepts that we'd actually like to implement. Plant is where we plan and test. We go from potential solutions to tested solutions that we're actually ready to implement. During harvest, we implement the validated solutions and the controls across our target area. For expand, we replicate the solution across the rest of the product family processes so that we can get to the level of throughput and profitability for the product family that we're focusing on. And then we go back to step one and we assess what do we focus on next. Okay. So with the discover phase, we're assessing and reviewing our demand assumptions. Very important right now, right? So we're also looking at supply chain and our current operations as well. So we're doing a SWOT analysis, looking at our internal strengths and weaknesses, looking at our external opportunities and threats, and we can look at those on a scale for the positive and negative impacts of each of those, right? So then once we have that information, we need to define which product family it makes sense for us to focus on and how is the value defined by the market segment that is served by that product family. So let's say we have these 7 product families, and this is the throughput that we get from each of them for our company, which happens to nicely work out to be 100. Okay. So we set our goal to increase our throughput by 20%. All right. So our target now is 120. And we identify where do we want to focus on first based on this information. Okay. So let's pick our top 3 product families to improve. Well, this one, and this one. And my daughter asked me, well, why did you skip over the third? It looks like it has more throughput than the fourth. And I said, aha, guess what? Back here when we did our analysis, we found that these two, the demand is increasing. In the fourth one, it's going to be increasing much more than the rest. So it's accelerating, while the others are less significant and the third one's actually declining. Okay. So now we need to figure out where do we need to focus within our organization to make this happen, right? So we need to figure out what facilities do we need to go to and what departments within those facilities do we need to focus on. So we're looking internally, we're looking at our supply chain, and we're also looking at the distribution and logistics, okay? So let's start with internally. We realize that 80% of this product family goes through plant or facility number 1, okay? 20% of it's going through 3, and so on. So with that in mind, we're looking at our product mix by throughput dollars and our facilities. Which ones does it flow through? Okay, so looks like if we want it to drive up our throughput by 20%, if we can assume that we can improve whatever we're working on by 25%, then this would give us plus 7.2. This would give us plus 3.75. This would give us plus 1.75. And that is not enough, right? So we know that the first 2 facilities we need to go to are number 1 and number 4, okay? And then guess what? We can roll out what we've improved here at the other facilities, right? During the harvesting, okay? We've already planted it. We've continued to expand, right? We figured out what to do, and now we know that there are other places we can do it. So this brings us another 5.5. And then we see that there are still some other facilities that also produce these. Okay. So that leads us to some additional gains, right? So if we follow through that whole process, we see that we can achieve that 20% that we were after. Okay. In a lot of companies, their throughput, um, in order to cover their operating expenses and their overhead, it may be around 90% to 95%. And above that, it goes to the bottom line. So to increase it by 20% should have a significant improvement or a significant impact on profitability. Okay. So then, now let's go to the survey phase. So we figured out what do we want to achieve and where do we need to go to make it happen. So now we need to identify and understand how things work and what do we need to change. So we need to identify the flow, the obstacles, and what metrics we have. And while we're doing this, we're going to work with the subject matter experts because they're the ones that work with it day in and day out. So we'll create a high level process map. We'll create facility maps and do a spaghetti map for the basic flow of the high level process steps through those facilities. Then we'll work with the subject matter experts to develop a SIPOC map for the major process steps in those facilities. Okay, so we're talking about what's the output, who's it for, what are the requirements, what inputs do they have, who did they get them from, and what are the requirements so that they can run the process, and then finally, what are the process steps. Okay, so then we need to review the documents, and by the way, note the revision dates. Sometimes these things are antiquated and obsolete and need to be updated. So we need to know what the voice of the customer is and the specifications. We need to know the SOPs and work instructions. And we need to know if there are any corrective actions out there. And this gives us really good information on how things are supposed to work and where they flow. Okay. Then we need to identify the current metrics and performance and what are the behaviors that we're using to impact them now. Some of them are going to be good. Some of them are probably going to cause local optima and conflicts within the system. Okay. Now that we have all this information in hand, let's go out and visit the process. So perform a gimbal walk, do a waste walk, look and see if anything's jumping out at you, and do a process audit. See if we're actually doing what we said we're supposed to be doing. Okay. So it's a good idea to review the 6 M's on a fishbone diagram and remember Murphy's Law, right? Then we can create a station level spaghetti map now and look at what are all the process steps they've got to do and where do they go to get all their inputs so that they can do their work. Okay. It's another good tool that can identify waste that can easily be eliminated. So finally, we get together with the subject matter experts and do an FMEA and do those on what could go wrong with these inputs and these outputs and the process steps for each of the SIPOCs that you've done for the stations in that area. And so we're looking at what could go wrong, what's the impact if it happens, what's the probability that it'll happen, and what's the likelihood that we can actually detect it if it does happen. Okay. So this is all feeding into the next level. So once we have that, we can time study and do a value waste analysis of the process steps. So this, let's say we just recorded 10 different cycles through each of these process steps, A through E in a department. Okay. And then we can look at the waste in each of those, and we can drill in further by spending a day at the station and seeing like how much waste do they have at different periods and different cycles throughout the day. Okay. And then we need to collect some other process information: cycle time, process times, changeover times, downtime, inventory levels, what's the breakdown of the overtime, how many stations do they have on how many shifts, and what are the head counts for each of those, as well as on the overtime. Then we can prioritize our risks and obstacles because we've got we know what they are and we've actually quantified them. Now, so let's look at frequency and impact of our obstacles and our wastes, and then multi-vote with the subject matter experts on from high to low on our obstacles for of our of each of them, and we're going to organize those based on the high level process steps so we know which ones to prioritize. Okay, and then we can um, basically prioritize them as urgent versus importance. And you would start with the quadrant for urgent and important, then go to important, not urgent, and so on. Okay. Then we enter the explore phase. This is where we come up with ideas to overcome the obstacles. So we brainstorm our solution ideas for each obstacle, starting with the highest ranked obstacle first. We're also going to do the low ranked obstacles because there may be some low hanging fruit there that allows us to have more options for our sequence of improvements. Okay, so remember this from the previous slide. Then we review our common TLS solutions, such as 5S, making sure there's a full kit for the operators, quick changeovers, downtime reduction, defect reduction, mistake and error proofing, benchmarking, standard work. And there's some fun stuff like cross training, partial line balancing, staggering shifts, and covering breaks. From TOC, we've got drum buffer rope and buffer management, and Kanban from lean. We can also establish metrics like OEE, which if you take it to the next level, you can divide out the performance into the time performance as well as load performance and track that on your constraint. And also we need to think about what reviews and audits we need to have in place. We can also look at design for manufacturability for any easy running changes that we can do. We may consider getting some of the ideas out on the table now that would be important for redesign at a later phase. Okay, so then we rank um, those potential solutions based on how easy we think they would be to implement and how hard and how much impact they would have. Okay, so instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4 like this with our obstacles, we're actually going easy high to easy low first before we get into the hard stuff. Okay, so then we can create a simplified QFD of the solutions versus the obstacles. This is typically used for when you're designing a new product, okay, or redesigning a product. So you can compare what are the things that you're trying to achieve with what solutions that you're coming up with to achieve those, right? So we can use a simplified version of this to help us select which ones we want to do for the most impact. Then we can sequence them. So during the plant phase, we are talking about planning and testing those solutions. So we're prioritizing our first wave solutions based on ease versus impact, and we're using the estimates relative for how effective we think these solutions will be relative to the time study data. Okay. Then we have the subject matter experts multi-vote those top solutions and keep adding them up until we have enough to achieve the percent improvement that we wanted from our target. What that means is we may have several things that are more difficult or take longer to implement that we can do later that can continue to get us to a higher level of improvement that we can use later. So this allows us to move on to the next stage where we establish the sequence and assign responsibilities for the selected solution. So we can use a RACI chart for that, which defines who's responsible for it, who's accountable for making sure that whoever is responsible for it did it good enough and improves it, who needs to be consulted, and who needs to be kept informed. Okay, then we pilot test using the plan, do, check, act method and putting all of these solutions that we're working on and implementing in a critical chain project management plan. Okay, so we're following plan, do, check, act. And we got a series of these on a critical chain. Okay, so as we're doing that, we're testing and refining our solutions to go from a concept or idea to something where we've prototyped it and we have what we actually would like to use for production. The concept's kind of cobbled together. This is more professional. Then we do a pilot production run where we do it at a little bit more higher volume as if it's at the actual production rate. And then we finally get it to the point where we can launch it into production, where it's validated. And then we compare our enhanced performance to the baseline. So each time we go through from concept to prototype to pilot build to production launch, we should be identifying tweaks that can be made to improve upon the solution and take it on up to the next level. Okay. So during the harvest phase, we're implementing the validated solutions and controls across the target area. So this means we need to update all the process documentation and follow our change management processes. So we're updating the specifications and the acceptance criteria, the SOPs and work instructions, any checklists and audits, and we're training the leadership and supervision and the employees on all the changes and all the updated documentation. Make sure that they understand it and they know it to the level that they can do it and actually train others. Okay. And we also need to set up the metrics and any layered audits to keep things from going backwards. Okay. During the expand phase, we replicate the solution implementation and roll it out into other facilities or other production lines for that target product family. We also look for other areas that the solutions could apply, and this allows us to choose the sequence in which we want to implement them so that we can have the most impact. Because although we could do it, it doesn't mean that it's the next thing that we should be focused on necessarily. But so long as we know that we could do it, that allows us to sequence when we should do it. So then we repeat, we go back to discover. So let's imagine we're starting from the beginning here. We're going to figure out which product family has the most potential if we improve it to increase our profitability. Okay, so we list all our product families. We list the high level process steps, and I probably should have threw an additional column on here that says 0 and says which facilities they actually go through. Okay, so from there, basically you can identify which product families go through which process steps or facilities. Okay, so you can create a crude model like this, kind of a stick and dot model, and a more advanced one would be if you did a VAT model from the TOC tool set, and this is kind of a crude one that I did in PowerPoint. So let's say we want to, this helps us to identify the process flow or routings for these different products. They don't all flow through all the same, right? So let's say we want to improve our strong market product, our slow market product, and our any market product first. The good news is that if we discover that we're focusing on some station or process that's shared by other product lines, those product families are also going to benefit. So we might raise the throughput for them as well. Okay. For instance, another product would be improved if whenever we improve these stations. Okay. So let's take a high level process map now and say, like, okay, where should we focus? There's a lot of things that we could be focusing on here. So where's our constraint? What if we improve is going to have the most impact? So one thing that I'd like to look at is where's the longest cycle times? Where's the most work in process? Who works the most hours, such as we have certain areas that work weekends or more shifts or more overtime. Where's the most rework occurring? And we may need to focus on which process is causing it rather than where is it being fixed, okay? So we can use our 5 whys. Okay, so let's say we collect some process information for our various high-level processes, and we find, okay, we've got the most inventory here, we've got the longest cycle time, we got the longest changeover time, and we got some pretty high downtime for this station. So it's probably our first candidate that we need to improve within this particular facility that has this value stream map. But we also noticed that if we improve this a little bit, we'll move our constraint very quickly over to here, which has comparable levels of indicators here. And we also noticed that we've got a weekly production schedule going to every process. So this is telling me that we're creating a push. So each of these is just probably trying to maximize their efficiency and productivity, which is going to lead to local optimization. Okay. They do not have a pull system in place here. They do not have drum buffer rope or Kanban driving this operation. Okay. So it's basically old school. So those of you that joined on the first couple of webinars are familiar with this. So what we came up with here is that if we focus on D, followed by F, followed by B, this sequence of improvements has a higher impact by an order of magnitude than other sequences. Okay. So keep this in mind as we're selecting projects. So now that we've figured out what are our three, which three product families do we want to go to, which facilities do we want to go to, and which departments should we start focusing in first, now it's time to get more information from the subject matter experts. So if we talk to them about food waka, which is not a Japanese term, by the way, this will help us identify the symptoms and obstacles that are inhibiting our flow. So let's put us we'll take our high level process map and our SIPOC map with us, and we'll have a meeting with the leadership and the employees that are the subject matter experts, and we'll ask them, okay, what makes you frustrated, upset, disappointed, worried, angry, concerned, and anxious about how the processes work? So think about, process step A. Anything wrong with your inputs or outputs, the requirements, and so on. And we're basically asking them what could go wrong, what's the impact if it does, and what's the likelihood that we could actually detect it if it does happen, and keep it from traveling on down through our processes. Okay, so this is telling us what's wrong and what needs to be changed. These emotions are driven by their motivation to want to do a good job and be recognized for what they contribute and how valuable they are for the team. So when they have these feelings, it points to things that if we fix, will allow things to flow better. Okay. So now we're talking about the project prioritization with the chain of solutions. So we start with, you remember at the beginning when I said that it's like a combination of a bunch of tools. So we start with like a high level process map. These are all the processes we have to go through in order to get this product through our system. Okay. So let's take cycle times, for example, to help us to prioritize which ones we should focus on first. So based on this, the ones that take the longest are going to reduce the flow out the back door to ship, right? So the first one's going to be the C, followed by D, followed by P, right? They're all relatively close. So if we made a 20% improvement at one, we're going to be moving the constraint to two, right? So by knowing all this information, it allows us to choose if we want to keep our constraint in the same place, so that if we're scheduling based on how much the constraint can handle, we're not constantly changing the focus of our scheduling mechanism every time we make an improvement. Okay. So the next thing we do is with our subject matter experts. Remember, we looked at a SIPOC map and the FMEA, and we figured out what are the obstacles for all of our processes and the wastes that they have to deal with day in and day out and drive them nuts and cause them food waka. Okay. So the next thing we do is we measure those value and wastes, and we rank them based on the actual measurements and the snapshots we got. So we've got this much value in that process, in that cycle time, this much business value adding time, and this much wasted time. Okay. So then we identify and rank the solutions that match up and eliminate those wastes and obstacles. Okay. So now we know what should be changed and what we can do about it, right? And remember, before we did this, we reviewed some of the common tools of Lean and Six Sigma and the TOC, and the subject matter experts can then help figure out how those could be applied in their situation. Okay. The next thing we need to do So this is what it may look like to measure the processes. Okay. You imagine that these are the processes that it has to flow through in order to be done in this department. So we have a wasted step, two value adding steps, a business value adding step, another wasted step, a value adding step, and then another wasted step, and so on. These diagonal lines are time waiting between stations. So imagine this one was done and the product sat there and waited until this station was done with another unit before it could start. Okay. So this is the process time breakdown when it was actually being worked on. But if we look at the overall department lead time, we actually count this time that the unit was sitting there also as waste. So we've got two different ways to look at that with our pie charts over here. Okay. So now let's say we pick one of these stations and we go in a little deeper. We understand what is happening throughout the entire day or for some specified period of time, and we see how it's fluctuating from cycle to cycle. And with observing it and doing a time study, we can actually identify exactly what those problems were, what those obstacles are, and how much time is impacted by those. Okay. So remember from the theory of constraints, we can put a bunch in, but our constraint's going to limit how much we can get through the organization. So think of that for this process that has these times that we measured. We measured 10 cycles through each of these 5 process steps. So the jagged line is the individual observations. The purple line is the average time. And this yellow box represents the range of values. So we go from the minimum to the maximum. Okay. So which process do you think we would need to improve first to get more through here? Right? It'd be C because it takes the longest, right? So that's going to dictate how much we can get done per day or per week, right? So then we need to review the metrics and see how they're aligned to how they align the motivation and behavior of this area with the goal. Are the metrics driving these processes to compete with each other, or are they all working together to get it onto the next department? Then we identify and analyze the underlying assumptions for all of our procedures and processes and how we think that we should run this area. Okay. Then we get together with the subject matter experts and we collected all the obstacles and we got all the solutions and now we have the data. So now we can prioritize if we want to get 20% improvement, what things should we do first? So they said, well, we multi-voted and we said that these would be the easiest and the most impactful to get us that first round of 20% improvement. Okay. So this is what they wanted to do. We're going to make the value flow first by reducing the waste. So we're going to identify and eliminate any unnecessary steps of the constraining process first. So we identified 2 decent steps we could eliminate there. And we noticed that by the time we reduced the time here, we've moved our constraint. So we decided to go ahead and implement another step eliminated here. Then we also noticed that these guys are done way sooner than these guys, but they always seem to look busy. But when we time studied, we found it really doesn't take them that long to do their process. So guess what? We can also balance this by giving them some process steps that reduces the cycle time from these guys. Now, you may think, well, that's bad. We're increasing the time here. Well, it doesn't really matter because our goal is to get more through this entire department, not just sub-optimize this local efficiency at process B, right? And we also found a small step we could offload to them and a bigger step we could offload to them, okay? So now these green dashed lines represent our new average times, okay? So now let's do some other things. How about we implement 5S and some error prevention? So we found that we could do that here because when they have their high variation cycles, they're actually taking longer than the constraint now, right? Likewise with this station and this station. So let's implement things there now. So we implement 5S just at those stations. Okay, we didn't touch this station yet because it's still less than it. Okay, so now let's say we need another 20% improvement. Now let's look at what can Six Sigma help us with, such as to increase our efficiency and effectiveness. So we want to reduce the time taken now for our value adding steps. So let's see, what do different stations and um, different shifts do where they have the best method, and how do we combine those to make the best so we can reduce the high cycles and get them closer to the lower. Okay, so let's do it at the constraint first because we know that we'll ring the cash register as soon as we improve that. Okay, then let's do it over here. Then how about here? And now we've made another 20% improvement. Let's go into continuous improvement mode and set up our metrics and see what we can do to identify and eliminate the next round of obstacles. Okay, so we're going to use a 4 blocker for that. We set a target and we're tracking what are the obstacles and waste that happen each day that interfere with us getting more of our goal. And then we make a breakdown of that with a Pareto chart that combines what was wrong as well as where did it come from or where did it happen, so that this allows us to rank what things we should fix next and use the subject matter experts, train them on problem solving to identify what the root causes are and who's going to do what by when in order to solve it. So you can imagine those first 2 phases, we did these with some Kaizen events and quickly got some improvements. And now we've moved on to doing Kaizen events in other areas. And we've trained the subject matter experts on how to do problem solving so they can drive this over the next couple of months. Okay. And what you'll quickly see is that you'll go beyond your goal here. This will drop down quite a bit. These bars will come down and move to the left. And you'll get to where over the course of 2 or 3 months, you should dramatically see a more stable process with a lot less obstacles and issues that they're facing. So now we've taught them how to reduce their own food waka. Okay. So, and we've taught them how to use plan, do, check, act with problem solving to make that happen. Okay. So now we can continue, right? So we're eliminating the root causes of the high side variation. Okay. So once again, we started with our constraint. Then we noticed that if we didn't do anything with this one, now it's like in a tie for the constraint, right? So we need to decide which one and go ahead and improve the other one, whichever one we don't want to be the constraint, right? Oh, and by the way, during our first round with our chain of solutions, we came up with something we could eliminate here, but we didn't need to yet. But you see now, almost half the time, it takes as long as the constraint. So now it's time to implement that. Boom. Okay, we reduce its average back down to where we know where our constraint is again. And likewise, we continue to remove the root causes, and we went from this much variation down to this. Okay, and finally, we removed this step that we found during round 1 of our chain of solutions as well, so that this one is more consistent as well. Okay. So we basically went from before looking like this for our cycle times to this afterwards. Okay. So roughly 40 to 45% less cycle time at our constraint, which is huge. So we went from something that looks like this for our department to something that looks like this, to where you can almost get double through here because you're doing it in about half the time. Okay. Notice we left some waiting time here. That's because this is our constraint and we want this process to have units ready that they can work on at all time. Basically, we've got drum buffer rope going on here. And the more stable we can make this, the lower we can reduce this wait time as well. Okay. So what we've done here is we've come up with a way to continue to increase our profitability. So that means we're increasing sales and decreasing the expensive relative to those sales. So we're getting more through our system with less rework, defects, and overtime, and less um, less inventory and the costs that go along with managing all that extra inventory. So we've dramatically increased our profit, and typically, a lot of those improvements don't cost a whole lot. Okay. And if you do them in the right sequence, your previous improvements are actually funding the ones that actually do cost money. So the benefits here, we increase our customer satisfaction because we've got better on-time delivery, better lead time, better quality. Most likely it's easier to do business with us. The company benefits from increased throughput. There are more sales with the same amount of resources roughly. And our inventory's down. We've got higher inventory turns, which means better cash flow. Our operating expenses are less because we have less material waste, less rework, less overtime, less turnover. Our employees are more satisfied because they've got a better understanding of the process. We listen to them. They got to participate in making things better. Now they can do their work and accomplish more with less effort and frustration. They're more effective. They've got more confidence and pride. And there's an increased potential that they have better job security, better benefits, and increased pay because now the organization has more that they can share, right? So tomorrow the webinar is going to be about how you can create a roadmap that can and how the chain of solutions fits within that so that you can get to the point where you're going from wherever you're at now to the point where you've got scalable, solid growth that's stable. Okay. So we're basically taking this to the next level by looking at how it can affect the value chain because you're only as good as your value chain. It's not just your organization exists in a vacuum, right? Um, so consider this your organization and you're dealing with whatever your weakest links are, right? That's within your span of control. Now we're looking at what do we need to do so that our supply chain can be stronger as we get stronger, okay? As well as our distribution and logistics. They may be outside of our span of control, but they're certainly in our sphere of influence, right? So what can we do to help them benefit as we grow? So think back to this piping diagram, right? And think of your value chain as looking something like this. It's got a flow, right? So we may be able to start here with what's within our span of control and then realize that if we want to get it any better than this, we need to start collaborating, okay, and coordinating so that we don't find ourselves um, running out of what we can do, okay? So now we can sequence our improvements with our extended value chain partners. Okay, so think of it like you're going through these phases. We're assessing where we're at versus where we want to be and how things are working now. We go into a rapid improvement strategic project phase mode. Then we train more people on how to cause these changes and what they can do. So it's not just a few people that know how to do it anymore. Now it's happening throughout the organization in parallel. Then we start to work with our value chain partners. And eventually, our value chain is much stronger than the competition. Okay. So you can also look at it like this over time. We start out with our strategic rapid improvement projects, which puts us on this curve that's increasing very fast. Okay. So we're getting more dollars out with our existing resources. Then we need to pump the brakes and we can still improve, but not as fast. Otherwise, we will outrun our value chain. Okay, so during this phase, we can go into 4-blocker mode where we are doing continuous improvement with our subject matter experts while we're helping our value chain partners go into this mode with the strategic improvement projects in their area. So if they're doing strategic improvement projects, that means they're not just throwing dollars and capital projects at everything, which typically take a lot of time and just adding more overhead in order to keep up with our pace, right? So if we help them do this, that helps them keep their costs under control while they're still supporting our volume, right? So then we can go through another phase with strategic improvement projects in our organization. And then we need to cycle back and figure out what's our weakest link in our value chain again, and so on. By the third pass, we're probably at the top of our food chain in the markets that we're serving. Okay. So now we're outside of the box of the traditional performance limits. So if anyone's interested in learning more about how to do this in your organizations, um, just get a hold of me and we can set up training if you're interested. I can also help with coaching and consulting in your organization if you want to go that route either way. So just send me an email if you're interested, and we can get the ball rolling. And we can do a lot of this stuff remotely, which is great for nowadays. So if anybody has